Story 1. This all happened back in 2020 when the world seemed to just come to a screeching halt because of the COVID pandemic. Everyone was holed up in their houses, but being a big fan of backpacking and camping, I took the lockdown as a chance to explore some national parks. I figured it was the perfect way to escape everything while still keeping my distance from people. One of the places I ended up was a creek out in Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. Now, without getting into too much personal stuff or giving away my identity, let us just say something happened to me in 2019 that flipped my life upside down. A mistake I made at my job caused a lot of people to lose money, and my reputation took a serious hit. I became the guy everyone hated, and I had to uproot my life, moved to a new apartment, changed my phone number, and eventually quit my job altogether. For a while, it felt like I could not catch a break. My phone would not stop buzzing with texts from random numbers. Some of them were straight up threatening. I could not tell if it was one person using different numbers or a bunch of different people. After some time, though, the messages stopped, and I thought maybe everyone had finally moved on. Around the start of the pandemic, I was not working and decided to take some time for myself, which is why I was hopping between national parks. One day, I made the 3-hour drive to Rocky Mountain National Park. When I parked my truck and started hiking up the trail to the creek, it felt like I was the only person out there. Probably because it was right at the start of the lockdown, and folks were taking it pretty seriously by staying home. Plus, it was still winter with a thin layer of snow on the ground. Every step I took made that loud crunching sound, which echoed in the silence. When I finally reached the creek, I saw it was not frozen. The water was still flowing, and the whole scene was just peaceful. Exactly the kind of escape I had been looking for. I found a spot a little off the trail and set up camp. After pitching my tent, I gathered some wood, started a fire, and cooked some sausages on my little camping stove. It felt like a moment of calm I had not had in a long time. As it got dark, I turned on my headlamp, lit a joint, and started smoking to relax even more. Just a few puffs in, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Since I do not have many people texting me outside of my family, I checked it right away. My heart skipped a beat. There were several texts from an unknown number. The messages were strange. The first one said, "How's your camping going, buddy?" The second said, "It's beautiful out here." The third one made my stomach drop. "I see why you came up here." I froze. It was not just the messages themselves. It was the way they were worded, like whoever this was knew exactly where I was. My first instinct was to reply, so I typed, "Who is this?" If they had just asked about the camping, I might have thought it was a family member checking in. But these texts, they felt personal, almost like someone was out there watching me. The weed in my system did not help. My anxiety went through the roof, and I found myself standing up, spinning around in a circle, scanning the dark woods for any sign of movement. The sun had set, and shadows were creeping in from every direction. I went straight to my bag and pulled out my Sig Sauer P365 handgun. Having it in my hand made me feel a little less exposed, but I was still on edge. Normally, I would have put out the fire before heading to bed, but the idea of sitting in total darkness scared me more than the thought of someone seeing the light. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay on my sleeping bag with my gun by my side. My phone was in my hand, and I stared at it, waiting for another message. Minutes dragged on, and nothing else came. I tried distracting myself. I turned on my headlamp and picked up my book, thinking I could finish where I left off. But there was no chance. My head was spinning, and my nerves were shot. I switched over to YouTube instead and started watching a murder documentary. Yeah, not exactly the smartest choice, considering the circumstances, but it was something to kill time. Just when I was beginning to think the worst was over, my phone lit up again. Another text popped up, and it made my stomach churn. The question I had sent in my last text no longer mattered. My heart was racing again, pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I decided to ask anyway, typing, "How did you know I'm camping?" But just like before, there was no response. The weight of the whole situation was pressing down on me. Was this some kind of prank by a friend or family member? Or worse, was it one of the people who had been harassing me before? And if it was, how in the world would they know I was out here, in the middle of nowhere? That was the part that made my skin crawl. I tried to keep myself occupied, watching videos on my phone to distract my mind. About an hour passed like this, but I noticed the glow from my fire outside was fading fast. The flames were dying out, leaving only embers. Without the usual sounds of bugs or animals that you get in other seasons, the winter woods were eerily quiet. It was just me and the occasional sound of wind brushing through the trees. The second one video ended. The silence crept in, heavy and almost oppressive. Normally, I would have welcomed the peace, but tonight, there was no peace to be found. Not with those texts hanging over me. Then it happened. The silence was broken. I heard it clear as day, the sound of human footsteps crunching through the snow. My stomach dropped. The steps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just 6 feet from my tent. My grip on the handgun tightened, my finger hovering over the safety, ready to flick it off in an instant. Suddenly, a flash of light lit up the inside of my tent. It was quick, like someone had either shined a flashlight or taken a photo. My heart was thudding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. The footsteps started up again, but this time they were moving away. I stayed frozen, listening to them fade into the distance until they were swallowed by the night. Just as I started to think the worst was over, my phone buzzed again. Another text. My gut twisted as I opened it. The message was a photo of my tent. The text that followed read, "Have a good night's sleep." That was it. Something inside me snapped, and it felt like the fog of my high cleared all at once. A surge of adrenaline and anger coursed through me, giving me the courage I needed. Without even thinking, I unzipped the tent, aimed my gun skyward, and fired 2 shots into the air. The noise ripped through the silence, echoing off the trees. I heard them run. The sound of hurried footsteps in the snow told me I had scared them off, but the fact that they had been close enough to hear my shots unnerved me even more. It meant they had been lingering, hiding somewhere nearby, watching. Fueled by fear and frustration, I yelled into the night, screaming a threat at whoever it was. Then I zipped the tent back up and climbed inside, my body still trembling from the adrenaline. I think it worked. The footsteps did not return, and there were no more texts that night. But the whole thing left me so wired that I could not sleep for hours. I lay there, wide awake, staring at nothing and replaying the events over and over in my mind. It felt like I had downed 3 cups of coffee all at once. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me, and I managed to drift off. Waking up to the morning sunlight felt like the biggest relief I had ever experienced. It was over. Whoever it was had been bold enough to follow me out there, but clearly had not expected me to be armed. Looking back, I doubt I seemed like the type of person who would own a gun. That was actually the first time I had ever fired it since buying it. To this day, it is still the only time I have ever used it. But it worked. It has been almost 5 years now, and I have not been bothered since. That night was like something out of a nightmare, and I cannot help but think about how differently things could have turned out if I had not brought my gun with me. It is a chilling thought, but one I will never forget. Story 2. Every year, my family had this tradition of heading up to northern Michigan for a weekend in October. My Uncle Mike used to own a 4-acre piece of land up there. The house on the property was big, with 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. Plenty of space for everyone. 2 of the bedrooms were set aside for the kids. My brother, Ben, and my sister, Sarah, shared one room, while our 4 cousins stayed in another. The rest of the rooms were for all the adults. Uncle Mike was a serious outdoorsman. Hunting and fishing were his bread and butter. He would go on camping trips all over the country, specifically for hunting. My dad, on the other hand, was more of an animal lover and would not hurt a fly. Still, he had joined Uncle Mike on a few of those trips just for the experience. On the property, there was a big stretch of forest that belonged to Uncle Mike. He had marked the boundary trees with red paint to show where his land ended. Beyond that, it was county-owned forest as far as the eye could see. The nearest house in that direction was probably a good few miles away. One year, during lunch, my brother Ben, my cousins Tyler and Charlie, and I came up with the brilliant idea to camp out in the woods overnight. Our dads were talking about hunting, and the idea just hit us. We ran it by them, and since they were already a little tipsy, they thought it was a great idea. Our moms, however, were not as thrilled. They did not outright say no, but their disapproving looks said enough. Dad and Uncle Mike helped us get everything ready. They grabbed a tent and led the four of us boys into the woods. My girl cousins and sister were not invited. It was a boys-only kind of thing. Joey, the youngest of us at 9 years old, started complaining that the walk was too far. That just made Dad and Uncle Mike laugh. They loved teasing us, especially when they had a few drinks in them. For context, I was the oldest at the time, around 13. Ben and Tyler were about 10, and Joey, as I said, was 9. We eventually crossed the property line into the county forest and found a small clearing covered in soft, green moss. Uncle Mike called them deer beds and said it was the perfect spot for a campsite. He even mentioned that he had camped there before. They gave us a clumsy, half-drunken crash course on how to set up the tent and made us help out so we could learn. It was a pretty big tent, easily big enough for 4 kids. Once we got it all set up, we threw in our sleeping bags and called it good. After that, we headed back to the house and spent the rest of the afternoon playing outside until dinner. At dinner, the moms brought up the camping idea again, saying we were too young to be out in the woods alone. The dads brushed it off, saying we would be fine. I remember my dad joking, "We are close enough to hear them scream if anything goes wrong." That joke landed a little too well. Later that night, our dads led us back to the tent. We all carried flashlights and extra blankets because the nights up there got chilly. I also packed a deck of Uno cards to keep us entertained. Once we were settled, Dad and Uncle Mike headed back to the house, leaving us alone in the woods. To be honest, we were not as close to the house as Dad had made it sound. We were far enough into the forest that you could not see any lights from the house. We sat in the tent, arranged in a circle, and started playing Uno. The flashlights lit up the space nicely, and for a while we were having a blast. Then we heard it. A scream, faint and far off. It sounded like a woman screaming. We all froze, staring at one another with wide eyes. My mind was racing, but I suddenly remembered something I had read about foxes. Their screams can sound just like a woman's. I told the others, and that seemed to calm them down a bit. Even Joey, who had been on edge, seemed to relax. We got back to our game, and I was on a roll, winning round after round. We had almost forgotten about the scream. Then it happened again. This time it was louder, closer, and it sounded unmistakably human. We all stopped playing. No one spoke. Even I was spooked now, and Joey looked like he was about to cry. That was when I told everyone to turn off their flashlights. We crawled into our sleeping bags and sat there in complete darkness. None of us had the nerve to run out into the woods and head back to the house. There is something about that primal fear of running, like whatever was out there would notice us, chase us, or worse. Somehow, hiding inside that thin layer of cloth felt like the safer option, even though it offered no real protection. So we waited, sat in silence. Every now and then, we whispered to each other, wondering if it really could have been a fox. I told them the truth. I did not know. I just hoped it was. At some point, I do not know who caught it first, but we all froze when we heard it. Quick, heavy footsteps crunching the leaves outside the tent. The sound was getting closer. We looked at each other, wide-eyed, hardly breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. That is when it happened. An ear-piercing, blood-curdling scream. It was a woman's scream, or at least it sounded like one, and it came from right outside the tent. The next thing we knew, the tent began to shake violently, like someone was grabbing it and thrashing it back and forth. All of us started screaming. Tyler and Joey were crying out in terror, while Ben and I were yelling, "Get away! Get out of here!" I do not even know what we were saying. We were too scared to think straight. I scrambled to the tent's zipper, my hands trembling as I yanked it open. "Run!" I shouted, and one by one, we bolted out into the woods with our flashlights. That run back to the house, it felt like a nightmare. Every step, every crunch of a leaf underfoot, felt like it might be the moment something lunged at us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. It was like every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to move faster, to get to safety. We made it to the edge of the property, still screaming at the top of our lungs. The lights from the house were a sight I will never forget. The entire family was already outside, waiting for us, looking confused and alarmed. We collapsed into the yard, breathless and shaking, and started yelling over one another, trying to explain what had happened. The screams, the footsteps, the tent shaking, everything. I could see the fear on their faces as we talked. Then it hit me. My cousins Jamie and Christina, along with my sister, were not outside with the rest of the family. I whipped around and pointed at Dad and Uncle Mike, accusing them of sending one of the girls out to scare us. That had to be it, right? But they swore up and down that they had not. Uncle Mike marched back into the house, and a minute later, he came back with Jamie, Christina, and my sister, all groggy and still half asleep. They had been in bed the whole time. That is when it sunk in, whoever or whatever had been outside that tent was not one of us. Without hesitation, Dad and Uncle Mike grabbed their rifles and headed into the woods. They were gone for what felt like forever, but when they came back, they had found nothing. Not a single trace of anyone or anything. The next morning, we all went back to the campsite together to gather our stuff. The tent was still there, tilted slightly and covered in leaves, but otherwise untouched. None of us spoke much as we packed everything up and hauled it back to the house. As you can probably guess, that camping trip was a one-and-done deal. None of us ever camped in those woods again. In fact, we did not even play outside after dark anymore. Not a single one of us. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there in the woods that night. Your guess is as good as mine. Story 3. What I'm about to share with you still leaves me questioning what's real and what isn't. This happened to me and my dad, and even now, 2 years later, I get a chill just thinking about it. I know how unbelievable it sounds, and if I were in your shoes, I wouldn't believe it either. But I swear to you, every word of this is true. 2 years ago, my dad and I went on a camping trip deep out in the countryside. We loved doing this, as it was always a great way to escape the noise of everyday life. This particular spot had everything: hiking trails, zip lines, kind of touristy but rich in history, sitting on Native American land. The first night, everything was perfect. Other families were camping nearby, there were campfires everywhere, and the sound of kids laughing filled the air. It was that peaceful kind of night you hope for when you go camping. We grilled hot dogs, roasted marshmallows, cracked open a few beers, and chatted with the people around us. A typical first night. But the second night was when things started to get strange. The staff told us that we were the only ones left in the whole park. No one else had booked a site. At first, we were thrilled. Having the whole campground to ourselves sounded peaceful. We spent the day hiking, fishing, and just taking it easy. At one point, we listened to a scary podcast by the river, leaning into the spooky vibe. We thought we were being funny, but by the time the sun began to set, we were feeling pretty good, buzzed from the beers, tired in that satisfying way you feel after a day outdoors. We decided to head over to the park's information center to charge our phones and grab some snacks before it got too dark. But on the walk back to our campsite, that's when something felt off. The air was heavier, and the sky had this weird tint to it, like twilight just wouldn't go away. My dad turned to me and said, "Doesn't this feel weird? Like we're in some kind of dream?" And he was right. Felt that way. The forest felt endless, stretching on in every direction. My chest tightened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We didn't talk much after that. Just kept walking, both of us glancing over our shoulders, almost expecting something to jump out from the trees. When we got back to camp, we stayed close to the fire. We didn't really talk about how weird it felt. It was like we both silently agreed to keep things normal, pretend nothing was wrong. We roasted marshmallows, played some music, even smoked a little weed to distract ourselves. It wasn't the typical father-son bonding, but it worked, for a little while. As the sun dipped behind the trees, we could barely see anything except for the fire. That's when the uneasy feeling shifted into something darker. Around 9 o'clock, while we were sitting by the fire, we heard a noise. It was like a bang, the kind of sound you'd expect if a tree had fallen. It came from the direction of the river, about 100 yards away, and it was loud and close. We grabbed our flashlights and aimed them toward the noise, but there was nothing. No movement, no glowing eyes. We laughed nervously, cracking jokes about Bigfoot, but neither of us believed that. A few minutes passed, and then it came again. Louder this time, farther off, but still the same sound. Same weight. We pointed our flashlights in that direction, but the forest seemed to swallow the light, only letting us see the trees right around our campsite. Then the third bang came. It was closer. That's when the real fear set in. Whatever it was getting closer. It was circling us. Before we could even gather our thoughts, the fourth bang hit, this time only about 20 yards away, maybe even less. The fear hit hard and fast. Whatever high I had from the weed was gone in an instant. My dad turned to me, his eyes wide, and I could see the fear on his face. We didn't need to say much after that. We both knew it was time to get inside the tent. We quickly threw the last of the firewood on the fire, hoping the flames would keep whatever it was at bay. Then we rushed into the tent, leaving everything else behind. I dropped to the ground, lying flat, while my dad followed me in, moving slower. Just as he was about to enter the tent, the loudest bang we'd heard yet came from outside. The noise was so close, it felt like the ground was shaking beneath us. My dad froze, staring out into the darkness. I said his name, trying to snap him out of it. He finally turned to me, his face filled with shock. Then, without warning, he jumped into the tent. "It's standing there," he muttered. "What's standing there?" I asked, but he didn't answer right away. "I don't know," he said, his voice shaking. "It's like a wall of darkness." He sat by the zipper of the tent while I buried myself under my sleeping bag, trying to be as quiet as I could. He kept the small knife in his hand, the only thing we had to defend ourselves. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. Then came this vibration, a noise I still can't explain. Started low, like a hum, but it wasn't just sound. It filled the air, almost like a feeling that pressed down on us, tightening our chests. I had never felt anything like it before. My dad whispered, "You hear that?" I couldn't answer, I just nodded. I was too scared to make a sound. Felt like we were being hunted. This lasted for about 5 minutes as we sat there, frozen. Then this sound came. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. Definitely not animal. Definitely not human. It was this deep, guttural, alien-like noise. I know it sounds crazy, but it honestly reminded me of the Demogorgon from Stranger Things. It was that unnatural. We didn't move, didn't breathe. We were too scared to even make a sound. I had this small mesh window next to me, but I couldn't bring myself to look outside. I was terrified of being seen. I just focused on controlling my breathing while my dad sat there with the knife in his hands. And then, in the middle of all that chaos, something strange happened. We both blacked out. Neither of us remembers trying to fall asleep. When we woke up, we were lying flat in the middle of the tent, both of us in a panic like something had been standing over us. My first instinct was to check the time on my phone, but it was dead. I asked my dad to check his, and his was dead too. Both phones had been fully charged the night before. We'd made sure of it in case of an emergency. We stepped outside to pee, still completely freaked out. We stood just 5 feet from the tent, back to back, trying to do our business. The air was still cold, and everything was pitch black. The food we had left on the table was untouched, and the fire, which we had stoked before going into the tent, had burned down to ash like it had never been used. The whole place felt wrong, like we shouldn't have been there at all. We stayed in the tent the rest of the night without saying much, both of us just trying to get some sleep. We packed up in silence the next morning, not speaking a word until we were in the car. When we finally did talk, we realized we both felt the same thing. We felt watched, like something was waiting for us to slip up. When we got back home, we told my mom about what happened. She thought we were crazy, suggesting maybe we had been drugged or had some weird reaction to the environment. But we knew it wasn't that. Whatever happened that night, it was real. We both experienced it, and we both know what we felt. To this day, we still don't know what it was. We didn't see it fully, but my dad came the closest. Whatever he saw, it wasn't human, and it wasn't natural. We've never heard anyone tell a similar story, and we haven't been back to that campsite. We haven't even gone camping since. I don't think we ever will.